By the summer of 1942, the German army had pushed deep into the Soviet Union. Their next objective was a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. What followed was not just a battle for streets and buildings, but a brutal struggle that would trap an entire army and change the course of World War II. By the summer of 1942, World War II had already reshaped much of Europe. Nazi Germany had launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union the previous year, under the name Operation Barbarossa. At first, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Cities fell quickly. German commanders believed the Soviet Union might collapse within months. But the war did not end in 1941. The Soviet Union absorbed the initial shock and continued fighting. As winter arrived, German forces stalled outside Moscow. The quick victory Adolf Hitler had expected did not come. In 1942, Germany changed its strategy. Instead of another direct push toward Moscow, Hitler ordered a new offensive toward the south. The goal was economic as much as military. German leaders wanted access to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was essential for tanks, aircraft, and mechanized warfare. Without it, Germany's war machine would eventually slow down. Between the German armies and the Caucasus oil fields stood a large industrial city along the Volga River. Its name was Stalingrad. The city itself held factories, rail connections, and a major river port. Control of Stalingrad would secure the German flank while their armies pushed toward the oil fields. It would also disrupt Soviet transportation along the Volga, a vital supply route. There was another factor. The city carried the name of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, capturing it had symbolic importance. For Stalin, losing it would be equally damaging. By late summer 1942, German forces approached the city. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, became the main force assigned to take Stalingrad. It was one of Germany's strongest armies. Experienced, disciplined, and well-equipped, German aircraft bombed the city heavily as the army advanced. The attacks destroyed large sections of Stalingrad, turning factories, homes, and streets into rubble. But the destruction created a new problem. Instead of open ground where German tanks could maneuver easily, the city became a maze of ruins. Collapsed buildings, broken walls, and debris-filled streets slowed movement. Urban warfare began. Soviet commanders understood that open battle favored German forces, tanks, artillery, and aircraft gave Germany an advantage in wide spaces inside the city. However, the fight changed. Buildings became fortresses. Rooms were turned into defensive positions. Factories, apartment blocks, and rail yards were fought over floor by floor. Snipers appeared among the rubble. Machine guns were placed in shattered windows. The distance between the two armies often shrank to a few meters. German soldiers referred to the fighting as Rattenkrieg, rat war. Control over single building could change hands several times in one day. One of the most intense areas was the tractor factory district in northern Stalingrad. Soviet factories that had produced tanks before the war reached the city. Even after fighting began, workers sometimes continued assembling equipment under bombardment. German forces gradually pushed deeper into the city. Street by street, they gained ground. By October, they controlled most of Stalingrad, but not all of it. Small pockets of Soviet resistance remained along the western bank of the Volga. Reinforcements crossed the river at night under artillery fire. Supplies moved across the water despite constant danger. The Soviet strategy was simple. Hold on. Every day the defenders delayed the German army, the more time the Soviet command gained to prepare something larger. While the Germans fought building by building inside Stalingrad, Soviet forces were quietly gathering strength outside the city. Entire armies were being assembled north and south of the German position. Their objective was not just to defend the city, their objective was to surround the attackers. General Paulus and the Sixth Army continued pressing forward, believing victory was close. German units captured major landmarks such as the grain elevator, the central railway station, and large sections of the factory district. But the cost was heavy. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in the narrow streets. Tanks were destroyed in close combat. Supply lines stretched longer as the battle dragged on. Despite these losses, German commanders believed Stalingrad was nearly finished. What they could not see clearly was the larger movement unfolding beyond the city. Soviet commanders had accepted that parts of Stalingrad might fall, but they had a different plan. Instead of only defending the city, they would trap the army inside it. And when the counterattack came, the soldiers fighting inside the ruins of Stalingrad would discover that the city was no longer just a battlefield. It was becoming a trap. By November 1942, the battle inside Stalingrad had reached a brutal stalemate. German forces controlled most of the city's ruins. Their soldiers had fought block by block for months, pushing Soviet defenders closer to the banks of the Volga River. From the perspective of many German commanders, the battle seemed close to victory. But the situation around the city was changing. While the German Sixth Army remained locked in urban combat, its flanks were guarded by weaker Axis allies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. These units lacked the heavy equipment and defensive strength of German formations. Soviet commanders had noticed this weakness for weeks. They had quietly moved large forces into position north and south of Stalingrad. Entire armies gathered in the open steppe beyond the city. Tanks, artillery, and fresh infantry units prepared for a coordinated counterattack. The plan was called Operation Uranus. Unlike earlier defensive efforts, this operation aimed not just to slow the German advance, but to destroy the army inside the city. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the counteroffensive began. Soviet artillery opened fire across a wide front north of Stalingrad. Within minutes, thousands of shells struck Romanian defensive positions. Soviet tank armies followed behind the bombardment, advancing quickly across the snow-covered plains. The Romanian units defending the German flank were overwhelmed. Within hours, Soviet armored columns broke through their lines and moved deep into the rear areas, behind the German army. The next day, another Soviet offensive struck south of the city, hitting more Axis units guarding the southern flank. The strategy was simple: attack the weaker allies protecting the German army, then drive inward until the two Soviet forces met. And that is exactly what happened. On November 23rd, Soviet troops advancing from the north and south linked up near the town of Kalach. West of Stalingrad, the encirclement was complete. Inside the pocket were more than 250,000 German and Axis soldiers, including the entire Sixth Army. The city they had nearly conquered had now become a cage. General Friedrich Paulus reported the situation to German high command immediately. His army was surrounded, supply lines were cut, and winter was approaching rapidly. Many German officers recommended an immediate breakout attempt. At that moment, the Sixth Army still had enough strength to try forcing its way west before Soviet forces fully strengthened the encirclement. But the final decision did not rest with Paulus. It rested with Adolf Hitler. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. He believed the Sixth Army could hold its position inside Stalingrad, while the German Air Force supplied them from the air. At the same time, he ordered a relief force under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to advance toward the city and reopen a land corridor. On paper, the plan seemed possible. In reality, it was deeply flawed. Supplying an entire army by air required enormous transport capacity. German aircraft simply could not deliver enough food, ammunition, and fuel. Weather conditions worsened the situation. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns attacked supply planes constantly. Many aircraft never reached the city. Inside the encirclement, conditions deteriorated quickly. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers lacked winter clothing. Food supplies shrank each day. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Ammunition became scarce. Meanwhile, Soviet forces tightened the ring around the city. Attempts by German relief forces to reach Stalingrad came close, but ultimately failed. The distance was too great. The Soviet defenses too strong. By December, the Sixth Army was starving. Frostbite spread among the troops. Medical supplies disappeared. Wounded soldiers filled improvised hospitals with little hope of evacuation. Despite the worsening situation, Hitler continued to order the army to hold its position. He believed surrender was unacceptable, But the soldiers trapped inside Stalingrad were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting to survive. And with each passing week, the circle around them grew smaller. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad was no longer a functioning offensive force. What had once been one of Germany's most powerful armies had been reduced to scattered groups of soldiers struggling to survive in the ruins of the city. The encirclement that began in November had tightened steadily. Soviet forces controlled the outer ring and continued pushing inward. Food had nearly run out. German soldiers survived on small rations that grew smaller each day. Horses had long since been eaten. Some units received only a few hundred grams of bread per day. Water often came from melted snow or ice. Cold became another enemy. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers lacking winter equipment wrapped themselves in blankets or scavenged clothing from abandoned buildings. Frostbite spread quickly among men already weakened by hunger. Medical care collapsed. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded and sick soldiers. Without medicine, even minor injuries could become fatal. Doctors worked in freezing basements with limited tools, trying to treat hundreds of patients each day. Outside the city, Soviet forces prepared their final assault. By early January, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, a systematic attack designed to crush the trapped German army. Soviet artillery pounded German positions continuously, followed by infantry advances that slowly reduced the pocket. The encircled German forces were divided into smaller and smaller sections. Communication between units became difficult. Command posts moved repeatedly as Soviet troops captured buildings and streets. Each new defensive line lasted only days or hours before being pushed back again. Inside Berlin, Adolf Hitler still refused to authorize surrender. He ordered General Friedrich Paulus to continue fighting and promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal in late January. Historically, no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion carried an unspoken expectation. Hitler believed Paulus would fight to the end, but the reality inside Stalingrad was impossible to ignore. The German army no longer had ammunition, food, or the strength to continue organized resistance. Thousands of soldiers were already dead from starvation and exposure. Many more were wounded or too weak to stand. The general surrendered. 2 days later, the remaining German forces in northern Stalingrad also laid down their arms. The battle was over. Out of the more than 250,000 soldiers trapped in the encirclement, only about 90,000 were still alive when the surrender occurred. Many of these survivors were severely weakened. Most of them would spend years in Soviet prisoner of war camps. Only a small portion would eventually return to Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad had lasted nearly 6 months. Its scale was enormous. Historians estimate that more than 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or captured during the fighting. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Factories became piles of rubble. The once busy city along the Volga River had been transformed into a landscape of shattered buildings and burned streets. But the importance of Stalingrad was not measured only in destruction. It changed the direction of the war. Before Stalingrad, German armies had advanced deep into Soviet territory. They had won major victories and captured vast regions of land. After Stalingrad, the situation reversed. The destruction of the Sixth Army weakened Germany's position on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces began launching larger and more aggressive offensives. From that moment forward, German forces increasingly fought defensive battles. Stalingrad also had a psychological impact. For the first time, the world saw that the German army could be decisively defeated in a major battle. Soviet morale rose dramatically. Allied leaders recognized that the balance of power in the war was shifting. The victory at Stalingrad became a symbol of endurance and sacrifice for the Soviet Union. The city itself was later rebuilt, but the memory of the battle remained central to the history of World War II. What had begun as a campaign to capture oil fields and control a river had turned into one of the most brutal battles ever fought. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, an entire army had disappeared.